this town hall. I'm Colombe, one of the co-founders of Atlas, and I'm very, very, very excited to be joined by a special speaker that I'll introduce in just a second. To give you the background on this town hall today, at Atlas, we started grassroots consultations on democracy and governance. So actually my two favorite topics in the entire world on what type of democracy do we want to see at the global level? Is it something possible? And if so, what do people, normal people, actually want out of democracy at the global level? And it's a topic that is often philosophized upon by a few experts and academics, and something that us, the people, think much less about, although we are quick often to criticize for good and bad reasons existing intergovernmental organizations. So we started those consultations and we have a lot of ideas. Basically, we're in the debate space, and my co-founder Andrea will post the link of the consultations on Zoom as well. But we are in the debate space, and right now people are thinking, okay, how can we create a sense of belonging to the global level? And what are the competences? How do we make it happen? And so on. And for this, we are starting a series of events and to pick the brain of some people that are actually experts and working on this topic. And I thought, who else than Secretary General Thomas Garrett to join us to kickstart this? And let me explain why. One, we actually did quite a few events already with Thomas Garrett in the past, and they were amazing. Every single time we thought in very different ways about global democracy, and our members loved it. Two, he's actually the Secretary General of probably the only intergovernmental organization out there that is working on promoting, defending, and having a dialogue around democracy at the global level involving member states, where democracy is the core focus. Considering the fact that global governance and our view of global governance includes democracy, we thought he's the one person we should definitely include in this conversation to get his opinion and his expertise. So that's why I was so happy when you accepted. Thank you very, very much. I already have a lot of questions for you, but I'm sure our members will as well. Our point is very much to have an informal conversation and understand your point of view on democracy and global governance. So welcome. I can get you started with my first question, which is, in an ideal world, so if you had a magic wand, right? Like, let's say we wake up tomorrow and you can change the way the world works. What is the ideal democratic global governance you'd like to see?
Well, I think, what we're always striving towards is we're trying to strive towards a genuinely inclusive democracy, one in which there are no structural barriers to inclusion and participation, one in which there are no cultural or historic barriers or past obstacles. And so, once upon a time, decades ago, I was a political consultant. And one of the things you tried to do in those days to win election was you tried to identify 50% of your vote plus one. And you actually didn't encourage everyone to vote. Instead, you encouraged only your identified base to vote. And, I think that won a lot of elections in places that might not have otherwise seen a particular candidate or party win, but all in all, that was very bad for democracy. And we've gotten into this idea that, people just don't feel connected and they're not participating. So I would say probably an ideal democracy. We could talk about the things it would deliver to its most vulnerable populations, the things it would deliver to all people equally. But to me, just the greatest thing that could start moving us again forward is seeing more and more people participate in elections. As great a number as can participate, that's what we need to be having. And I think we're actually seeing that in a few places now, where we're starting to see populations that didn't have as high a trend of voting. In the United States, for instance, we're seeing younger people and persons of colors and communities that were marginalized. And so it's very exciting to see that. We have to really take that, build upon that, and keep that moving.
So do you think that we have a magic wand, right? So this is my perfect world. We have a global system of governance in which we can actually elect representatives. And somehow we build on the best practices coming from the US when it comes to including more and more underrepresented people, and other places across the world that manage to get more people to vote. Is that it? Is that the democracy we want? Is it replicating national level type of democracy at a global level? Or should we try to also innovate maybe I'm thinking, for example, a lot of the suggestions we got on our internal forum concerns having permanent citizens' assemblies or chambers by sortition, another chamber of government where citizens would be picked and act as a counterweight to the establishment. Are those ideas that you think could work at the global level, or do you think that if we were to start a global democratic system of governance, we should start by actually focusing on the very basic principles, which are let's elect representative and build from there?
So, we're now this year on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If I waved one and we had a perfect democracy, a global democracy, a nation by nation, full democracy, we would see adherence to those principles instead of backsliding and attempts to restrict those, what we're calling universal human rights. And so that's what we would see. We would see a place where governments strove, if that's the word, strived to adhere to those principles that they've actually almost all committed to. But, this is, in the lead up to this, I noticed one of your social media pieces mentioned some of the problems in the world today. And those problems stem from the very fact that nations cynically sign on to our founding document, the Warsaw Declaration, or agree to be bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they have no real intention of adhering to those that they find uncomfortable or threatening to their power.
And so on this, then, do you think that a global system of democracy could help in ensuring that nations actually, adhere to those principles and that they are held accountable to it? Let's say if we had, if you and I could vote directly for a global parliament, right? And that would represent us as people of the world. We probably don't have the same nationalities, so us as the people of the world. Do you think that this could help if they had real competences in actually ensuring that states, if they still exist in this ideal world, are adhering to the principles they sign up for?
Setting aside the magic wand for just a moment, which is such a nice thought, but setting aside the magic wand, one of the things I've so admired about the Atlas Network and that people engage with it is that you do hold such aspirations, but you also are very practical, and you're looking for practical and real-time ways to accomplish this. And so I feel like, there are reforms out there that are suddenly within our grasp that didn't exist before in the international architecture of human rights, or in the security framework that governs the world today. I really would say what we want to do is we want to look at these opportunities that exist now and actually start to piece those together towards this type of this quilt or this mosaic that you envision down the road.
Okay, so then what are those reforms that exist today that didn't exist before? Is it like, for example, the reform, do you believe that a way of achieving global democracy would be more to look at the reform of the UN, or to look at expanding regional organizations, or to look at making the community of democracies an intergovernmental organization with more power? What do you think would be the best way?
So, yesterday we were in New York City and we did an event involving several member states of the community of democracies, but also several countries that are democracies and are not active in our group. But we looked at the idea of gender responsive budgeting, not budgeting for women, it's initiatives, but gender responsive budgeting. And UN Women was there, and they spoke officially as to the gains that have been made in trying to promote this very valuable process that could really change the world if it were to be implemented to any degree in many places. And so I would say, there are things going on at it's not glamorous, but at the International Telecommunications Union, or at even such things as the Universal Postal Union. There are things that are going on within the UN system that are highly positive. We want to build upon those, but we also have to take into account the reality that on April 1, in just a few days, Russia is going to assume the presidency of the UN Security Council. And I think nothing is going to be probably more devastating to the idea of the United Nations as that. It's just a joke beyond a joke that a nation that is waging war on its neighbor, Ukraine. And, today's the anniversary of the Mariupol theater being bombed when it was clearly marked as a haven for children and civilians, and the Russians destroyed it, killing maybe 1,000 people inside. And they're about to become head of the Security Council. So while I'm optimistic and I can find those bright spots out there, in the work of UN Women, in the work of UN peacekeeping missions. We've had 69 of them to date. We have 16 active in the world today. You don't hear a lot about their work because the work is happening. They're doing their work, they're accomplishing their work. But, we're going to hear a lot about the Security Council in a few days. That's the kind of thing we need to target for reform. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do as you build towards, I think, the vision that Atlas and its members have long held.
And I think the Security Council is a perfect example, right, of what, and what I completely agree with the fact that there's a lot, the UN is doing an incredible job on so many things, right? It helps in reducing poverty, in supporting refugees, in supporting the most vulnerable, and so on. It is completely failing at democracy because it's not one of its core purpose at the beginning, right? It's not, it never established itself to be the democracy agency of the world or to promote this principle in the first place. So in a way, we can't expect it to lead on this, also because it's made up of so many authoritarian countries that don't have any incentive in making it democratic. So do you think that, for example, for those of us, like at Atlas, but there's a lot of other groups, such as the World Federalist Movement, Citizens for Global Solutions, and so on, that believe that we need somehow to have a more federal democratic world. Do you think that we should target our efforts at the UN and that we should try somehow slowly, step by step, to reform it, or that we should look elsewhere, not necessarily disregarding it, but saying, look, it's okay to have a global governance system that is made of authoritarian countries because we need to work together across the world. That's the truth. To solve climate change, we need to work with China. We need to work with a lot of stakeholders. But we should also have a democratic global governance system to talk about democracy, rights, and so on. Which one do you stand for? Do you believe in reforming the UN? I know it's not as simple as this, but would you put, if you were, would you put your efforts on reforming the UN or on trying to create something new with democracies that are willing to actually stick together?
So when the Community of Democracies was founded in the year 2000, one of the speakers at the founding gathering, where 107 nations came together in person to talk about democracy, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was there to speak. And one of the things he said was, it was his hope, it was his goal that one day the United Nations General Assembly would be the community of democracies. And, that was a very optimistic time in the world as we were coming out of a very non-democratic period, and we were suddenly seeing countries around the world attempting a transition to democracy. It was fascinating at that time, 106 nations that had gathered there adopted the Warsaw Declaration, these 19 principles of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Among those 106 nations were the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And I just think it's been very fascinating to see, how the two have separated in their path of adherence to those declaration principles. But, going back for a moment, just the idea that the United Nations could have been a community of democracies. I think, going into this Security Council presidency, that's hard for us to envision. But it certainly is still a goal that I think we could come back to. We could try to look at what I guess has amazed me the most about the UN system is how almost next to impossible it is to get the word democracy put into anything. It's not in resolutions. It's not mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals. We have to find, things to hang our democracy values around, such as good governance and other things. But I think as a goal, talking about reform, it can be as simple as trying to insert the word democracy, insert human rights explicitly into resolutions, statements, declarations, principles out of the United Nations. You can see that, I'm a glass half full person. I think to do this kind of work, you have to be an optimist. I think everyone at Atlas is an optimist that I have ever spoken to or been with. But, we just have to keep looking. I don't really see it as we should either do this or we should either do that. I mean, it's today we're at this special moment. Again, the war on Ukraine, I think, has brought us to this moment of awareness that the totalitarians, the authoritarians, are not staying in their borders. 22 years ago, Russia adopted the Warsaw Declaration and then spent 22 years destroying freedom in its country. And now it's turned that anti-freedom eye towards Ukraine. And of course, it had done that before to Georgia. It's done that in other places, in Chechnya. So, I guess the rallying cry, and I'm not much of one for big charismatic speeches probably, but the rallying cry is, we have to confront everywhere, everything.
Yeah. And I think that's when the power of different organizations and movements come into play, right? My question, obviously, I think for any change to happen, you need to attack it from every single angle. Business, politics, movements, trying to reform the establishment, trying to create new institutions, and so on. The truth of the matter is, everyone has limited capacity. So how are the best place to focus it? But first I want to jump on your point on including democracy in resolutions. I find it super interesting when we tried to register Atlas as a charity in the UK, it was rejected multiple times by the charity commissions. One of them because democracy is considered to be a political philosophy and a political purpose, and charities cannot have political angles, and they have to be apolitical, which is quite interesting, right? For a country like the UK that theoretically should adhere to human rights, etc., to consider democracy to be something that a charity should not be able to focus their energy upon because it's political and not rights focused or something like this. And I wanted to jump, I have two very interesting questions in the chats. Mary Gear is one of our members from Kenya. And she's asking, I'll just read her question. Well, actually, Mary, if you can speak, do you want to read it yourself? I'm not sure if you can unmute, otherwise I'll do it.
Yeah. Thank you. My question is, how do we achieve global democracy when in places like Africa, especially in Kenya, where I come from, we are still struggling with issues of inclusion? That is economic inequality. Actually, I'll call it economic injustice against women and human rights violation also meted on women. So how then do we achieve global democracy? Because this is a far-fetched idea in regarding to global democracy when you look at the things that women are going through, especially in Africa and in Kenya in particular.
So back to maybe one of the points I mentioned earlier, Mary, and that's just this idea that we must set for ourselves the goal of every person eligible to vote is able to vote and is brought into voting, into that very first step of participating. And it's just the very first step. Certainly you tend to turn out and vote when you see candidates who look like you and who speak to your issues. And so we have, there's all of that work I recognize to do as well, to have inclusive representative candidate slates. But I just think the idea of, again, trying to bring every voter, we physically go out and we help every woman in the village get to the polling station through whatever means necessary, whatever legal means necessary. We do what we can to get young people, perhaps at university and therefore not able to vote without returning to their home. We look at that. That's one of the policy recommendations, actually, our youth leads at the Community of Democracies is going to put forward in another week or so at the Summit for Democracy, is this idea of trying to level out voting for college-age students. But we go all the way down to seeing such things as one of our member states in the Community of Democracies looked at the issue of women in shelters, domestic violence shelters, and their address has to be kept hidden to protect them from their abuser. And the voting laws have been changed to allow them not to have their address listed on the public voting records in these situations. You know, a small number, not small enough, but it's just doing everything that we can, identifying every barrier out there to participation and trying to level that.
And thank you so much for this. I want to jump to Sam's question, but first I'll make a link with a debate. As I said, we're doing those consultations, right, on global democracy. And one of the debates that Nancy, actually, who's in this call, brought about was basic needs at the global level. And I think Mary's question kind of reminded me of this. It's, you know, indeed, making people vote at the national level is very important. But if we think about how to achieve global democracy, we have, at least at Atlas, we face a fundamental issue, which is how do we create a strong sense of belonging to the global level? How do we ensure that a global democracy actually deals with the very real issues that people have? So if we were to make the UN more democratic, or if we were to create something else, how do we ensure it's actually rooted in local and national realities, which means how do we ensure that it has the competencies to deal with it? For example, when you have countries that are still suffering from economic injustice linked to also past crimes of colonialism and so on, how do we address this in a way that it makes sense and that it actually deals with people's real concerns, that we can, and that people feel like global democracy is important to them and like they're heard? I know those are impossible questions, so I don't know if you have an opinion on belonging and ensuring that a global unity has a say over very real problems. But I think often in the world, the UN is seen, or other organizations, a bit like far away. You know, my immediate issues are paying my rent, and the UN cannot help me with this. And there's no redistribution system. So why should I care? I deeply care, but why should I care in theory?
Well, this is why I think I'm so grateful that Atlas has undertaken these consultations around the world, because you've identified things such as citizens' assemblies and other activities that I think brings the reality of democracy closer to people and provides that voice. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what emerges as it's happening in real time, but also your future conclusions that you issue from your set of consultations.
Perfect. So we'll send them to you. Sam, do you want to read your questions or yeah, add anything to it?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And you know, just begin with a historical observation that the League of Nations, the first draft of, you know, an international organization, continued to exist throughout the Second World War, and was utterly irrelevant, you know, after September of 1939, really. And I have to wonder if the United Nations has yet reached that level of irrelevance when one of its founding members, in this case, the Russian Federation, has so blatantly disregarded the charter. And this is really just on the issue of, you know, national sovereignty. That is, it is attempting to break down the stability of borders between nations by invading a neighbor and annexing its territory, which, if allowed, will be incredibly destabilizing for the world. So given, and we have more refugees than at any time since World War II, and in real numbers more than ever. So my question is, how can we make the UN more relevant? And would it help to bring the voices of citizens into the UN as opposed to just heads of state? So we, you know, heads of state, the executive branches of the governments of the world send their ambassadors to the UN, and then those ambassadors supposedly speak for the people of those countries, even if those governments were not elected. And I would like to hear your opinion about the idea of some kind of parliament that is elected, at least in terms of the countries that have elections, that would be non-binding, advisory, but at least provide a forum where people representing citizens, representing individuals rather than heads of state, would have a voice. And I think that, you know, one of the most interesting moments in the history of the UN was when Greta Thunberg address the UN because she addressed it as a citizen and not as somebody representing a particular national government. So that's my question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
So, one of the really interesting things is we look at April 1 and Russian Federation assuming the presidency of the Security Council is that the League of Nations actually expelled the Soviet Union.
That's right.
Happened right away. It was not like let's dilly-dally around with this and let's talk about how it can't be done. But when it invaded Finland, trying to violate the borders of a neighboring country, just as it's doing today, it was expelled. So that's interesting on the one hand, and it's a little bit, depressing on the other, that the League of Nations, which we view so much as a noble but failed attempt, actually was able to do something more concrete than we'll probably see in the next few weeks. But the idea of trying to bring citizens' participation into the United Nations, I think, is a very strong one. I tend to approach all of these things very incrementally. And, before we look at trying to get citizens' voices in, such as the example you mentioned, we have a current and immediate problem, and that is civil society organizations are being restricted and limited within the United Nations. And, the pandemic caused that in many ways, or afforded that opportunity to block the physical presence of civil society organizations that had long been active in the United Nations, found themselves barred from entry. Now that time is over, but at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, in New York, at the General Assembly, the authoritarian countries are trying to say such things as, we need to, for instance, one of the things civil society would like to do is they'd like to have hybrid access to the United Nations, meaning therefore people don't always have to travel there, but can speak through what we learned during the pandemic, Zoom, and through these methods. The authoritarian nations that sit on the Human Rights Council, on the ECOSOC committees and others, they're saying, no, it's either all in person or all virtual, but it's not in between. Why? Only because they know that opens up access to people who can't travel. And so probably one of the things, again, I feel like is positive that I could say right now is that I do believe for the first time, we really see democracies across the regional groupings working together to try to counter these authoritarian groups, which are primarily limited to, it's Russia and China, it's Iran, and then it's a few of their what are called like-minded allies within. And it's a group that, you can easily see democratic nations countering, but they have to come together and look beyond their regional groupings. They have to look beyond their deal making and say, these are the principles that we have to put forward in this battle. But yes, the idea of trying to bring citizens through a parliamentary assembly or through whatever opportunity to bring their voice directly would be important. The last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of conversation about the need for a female Secretary General of the United Nations, which has not yet happened. And so, there are definitely some things to be done there.
And let me jump on. Sorry, go for it, Sam.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
And let me jump on this. We did a campaign 2 years ago to elect we held fake primaries to bring forward female Secretary General candidates. And she was actually discussed at the UNGA, which was great. We're planning a similar campaign next time around to make the voice of the people heard and annoy as much as possible, as many countries as possible. And let me do one of my favorite activities and be the devil's advocate for 2 seconds. So Sam just mentioned a parliamentary assembly that would have no binding power. Let me take my Atlas cap off, and I'm 28, I'm French, I have my daily issues to deal with in my life. And like most people, I barely understand the UN because it's hyper complicated. I barely understand the global level because it's hyper complicated. And to be honest, I don't really have a reason to try to understand it because I don't have a say. One of the issues we face is it's very difficult to mobilize people on global issues and on the UN because they don't they don't see an ally for change, and they don't see a way their voice will be meaningfully heard. So why waste your time when you know that you won't be meaningfully heard? Wouldn't something like what Sam just proposed actually do some democracy washing, right? Like pretend that the UN is becoming more democratic. And I know, Sam, you're thinking about this already, so it's not about your proposal, but do some democracy washing. It would definitely be my perception. Oh, great, the UN is creating yet another body that no one will pay attention to, and wasting people's time because they won't listen to it at the end of the day. So isn't that a risk to look at it from a very incremental perspective? Obviously, there are always some wins and so on, but to allow the UN to kind of keep on going downhill when it comes to democracy, instead of giving it a big electric shock of, we can't stand this anymore. This is no longer acceptable that, you have a weird Security Council where some weird countries have more power than others in a very unequal manner where people are not heard. This is abnormal. We need to either break it down and reform it, or break it down and create something new. Do you believe that incremental approaches are always the best way? And do you believe that with incremental approaches, we can actually build momentum to create those changes?
Perhaps incremental was not really the right word. I think probably what I was trying to get across was that we should have the aspiration of this parliamentary assembly. We should have that aspiration. We should be talking about it, writing about it, educating others about it, demanding for it. But the point I was trying to make as we're doing that, as we're looking at this aspirational goal, we need to do something today, is what I meant. We need to take this step by step and do something today about attempts to limit the already limited and restricted voice of civil society at the United Nations. So I was not really meaning to say we should take this easy and slow. I think it's a dual track thing, but I think we need to look at what we have now as being lost. And we need to fight to hold on to what we have, because it's only with that will we build further towards something much relatively powerful, such as the assembly. So that was probably a poor use of word on my part.
No, I was bouncing off the very well established proposal that Sam was putting forward that is being advocated by a lot of federalist movements. And it's something we're debating in the consultations, right? Like, should we aim to create those bodies, or would it create more harm than good? Or should we aim to do it and at the same time do something else? And which I don't know what the answer is to. I just wanted to provoke it a bit. Because you mentioned protecting what we have, let me jump on the question we have in the chat that I'll read because it's a member that could not connect, that is saying, I'm a staunch believer in democracy. I live in South Africa. All over the planet, democracy seems to be in retreat. Is there hope to save it? So we know now that you're an optimist. You see the glass half full. What would you tell people who live in places where democracy is being attacked, which, to be frank, is a bit all over the world? And how can we have hope that it will be saved?
So I think for many of us, we have, I am older than probably several people here, but, we have lived with this idea of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it's immovable, it's unchanging, it's destabilizing to the region. It has this highly restrictive lifestyle it imposes upon its citizens. But look at what's happening there. It really is incredible. The end of the protest has been predicted for a long time, and it's made it through the winter. It's made it through the physical injuries that are inflicted upon these young people, these young women who protest in the street. And the protest is still going on. I just look around the world at so many different places, and I see that, the people's democratic aspirations are maybe not always being reflected by the government in place at the time, but very definitely the people's voices are on the side of democratic, robust action, not on the side of decline. Years back, when I did work in another organization with Pakistan, we would very often, poll, and you would find that, people felt if it was a choice of a stable military-led government, or if it was a democratic government, which might be a little bit less stable, they would choose the military. And then over time, you would start to see, they change and they would say, we want democracy. But then democracy would come in, and after a cycle or two, we'd start finding, unfortunately, that creeping up again of people saying we prefer stability. But I think now we still see in a place even like Pakistan that has gone through so many back and forths on this, there's always that hardy group that is just saying, you know, our future is with democracy, our future is with human rights and the rule of law. And I think we just see that again more and more around the world. So that's what gives me encouragement about the future. I think we're seeing for the first time democratic nations saying we want to work together to counter authoritarianism. The veil's been ripped off. Russia is not just a good gas trading partner. Russia is actually something very bad. And, you know, the pandemic has also opened up our eyes a bit. Not every democracy performed well in the pandemic, but for the most part, democracies exhibited resilience. They were listening to their people. They sought to safeguard constitutional rights. And we can contrast that to, you know, where the pandemic came from, China, which devoted its resources to silencing its doctors, to, restricting the movement of its people. So I think actually, again, you know, the momentum is on the side of democracy. We were at that turning point, and I think it's on the side of democracy. But we have to kind of get beyond this idea that democracy is one day a finished product, that we will get there and stop and have, you know, not to abuse his work, because this isn't what he said, but not to say we're at the end of history, but instead that, you know, it's something that is made by every generation. I was just looking at someone on social media today who was noting that, you know, he was born after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's now out, you know, producing ideas and sharing thoughts in the public arena. And I think that's what we need more of, this younger generation giving us these fresh thoughts. If I could just say one other thing, when I became Secretary General, Madeleine Albright, who was one of the founders of the organization, and I sat down to talk, and I was saying, you know, what are we going to do? The international order is just coming apart at the seams, and nobody seems to care about it or value it. And after she listened to me for a few minutes, she said, you know, I agree with you, but we need you not to spend your time being nostalgic for the past, but to take what you have and enable the new generation to build the security architecture, the human rights framework for the next 75 years. And that's really, I think, where we sort of are is, you know, a cynical politician will say to you, don't count on young people to turn out and vote. Well, that's being proven wrong as young people realize, you know, there's a real need for change out there, and they're going to be the ones to deliver it.
I really like this point. And I know something that I'll tell our members as well that you're doing is you have, as part of the community of democracies, youth leads that bring forward their recommendations, and you're actually presenting the report at the Summit of Democracies in Costa Rica in a couple of weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And with quite a bit of this. And something that always gets really under my skin, my parents have been guilty of this, is being told that young people, you know, don't care as much or take the rights we have been granted for granted, which I find ridiculous in so many levels. Number one, because as you said, it's not true. But number two, because we actually look to the future, not necessarily to the past, right? And for us, the fact that we have, for example, I'm lucky enough to have a right to vote. I don't think actually I'm lucky. I think it should be very basic. But I have a right to vote. And it doesn't mean that that's enough, or that, you know, I'm just looking to protect this. It means that I understand that I have this right and that I want more, that I want to be able to have more of a say, that today's democracy in which I live in the UK, I'm French, is made mainly of older men with very little citizen involvement, and it just doesn't work. And so we actually, you know, this is one of the things we mentioned, we're actually looking at citizens' assemblies, chambers by sortition, and proven best practices like participatory budgeting, and so on and so forth, that are proven to work, and where people can actually come together and find solutions for democracy and for the world. So I like this glass half full aspect. To bounce off it, you touched briefly on it, but we have a Hong Kong member who's asking, will democracies manage to unite and save regions under attack, such as Hong Kong yesterday or Taiwan tomorrow? Or are we on our own? And I think it's specifically relevant. At Atlas, we heard quite a bit at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Okay, why should we care? And obviously, we should all care about any region under attack, right? But I remember some members from Indonesia actually told us quite a bit. Look, whenever something happens in another part of the world, no one seems to be able to pay attention. However, suddenly we're all supposed to care about something happening in Ukraine. So, and I think the contrast is quite strong as well with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Although there's been support for Hong Kong and Taiwan, it's not really to the same level than what we've seen in Ukraine. So do you think that there's hope of democracies doing more for it? And how can we push them to do more?
So, as you look at dictatorships around the world that have suddenly collapsed, it's really interesting. You look at them on, let's say, day one, or on a Monday, let's say on a Monday, and they seem solid, invincible, untouchable. And sometimes by the end of the week, they're gone. And, we saw this in the Arab Spring. We saw, U.S. embassy after U.S. embassy, Western embassy after Western embassy cabled home to the Capitol. This man is in charge and his control is ironclad. And when he leaves, his son will take over and will continue the same thing. And so we've got to learn to work with this regime. And instead, shortly thereafter, these guys are just totally gone. And so they always look immovable until the day that they're not. And, I just say that to try to be encouraging to all of our friends in Hong Kong who, Hong Kong entered into, the United Kingdom and China entered into a good faith agreement that Hong Kong would be independent and free within the Chinese system for at least a certain number of years as, its course was charted. And instead, Beijing violated that less than half the period of time had passed. And so that certainly has set Taiwan on record. They realize now there is no one China, two systems for them in the future. They know what the future will be for them by looking at Hong Kong. But I would just say, it's never over. And so bringing this voice of Hong Kong to others right now is very important. And I appreciate that Atlas has done that. But in the final analysis also, you very much often are alone in these places. We try to encourage the diplomatic missions of our member states to protect journalists, or, we have a workbook on what diplomatic missions can do to support dissidents in the countries in which they're operating. But it really does come down to, people are very much alone, they're very brave, and they're very committed to freedom for themselves and their people.
Yeah. Yeah, I so often wonder how we can try to create the same momentum for other places than for Ukraine, right? How we can, as citizens, try to push governments to care more. I wanted to kind of close this session with a few questions about the community of democracies. So obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's the only, of my knowledge, intergovernmental organization that focuses on this beautiful concept that is democracy. And you've been heading it for quite a few years. So you've seen both its I think, beauty, which is countries do want to come together and do want to talk about democracy and learn from one another. And just this in itself is a big achievement. And I assume you've also seen some of its pitfalls in democracies not collaborating as much as possible and so on. Are you comfortable in sharing a few best practices we should learn from in successes from the community of democracies that we should actually learn from in trying to design any democratic system of governance, and things that you think were not either designed properly or the historical context didn't make it possible to create certain competencies or bodies and so on that we should aim to have in any new democratic system of governance?
And so,
so basically,
I think really
best practices and worst practices.
I think what really sets the community of democracies apart from other intergovernmental bodies is that it's not based upon a history such as the Commonwealth, or it's not based upon a language such as La Francophonie, which is made up of countries that are French-speaking, or the Lusophone countries related to Portugal. It's not made up of a religious basis, such as the Organization of Islamic Countries. And it's certainly not regional, such as the EU or the African Union, but it's made up of countries that seek to adhere. They seek to adhere to those 19 principles of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And so to me, that is what sets the community of democracies apart and makes it something different, is that it is a values-based, human rights-oriented body. And, the member states individually, our member states on our governing council, they really make up the leading champions out there at the United Nations, in the peacekeeping missions. They really do this. They do a lot of their activity on behalf of democracy and human rights themselves. Their country does that directly in aid to South Sudan, or in support to women's rights in Iran. Sometimes they choose to do that through the community of democracy. Sometimes they choose to do that more, again, just directly or through a multilateral body such as the United Nations. But they're all very, very active, and they've all committed to, identifying as countries that seek to support these sorts of values. So I think the fact that the community of democracies has been able to exist, even just 2 decades, is good, because, when I first became Secretary General, a very prominent foreign minister of a longtime nation, member state of the communities, asked me, he said, do you really believe democracy is enough to bind us all together? Because we all have our national interests. And, that was an interesting conversation. Another prominent foreign dignitary said to me, whatever you do, don't grow your organization, because the more countries that are there, the harder it will be to reach agreement on anything. And I said, yes, that may be true for your regional body, but these are all democracies. And he's like, well, try it and see what happens. And, there's some truth to what he was trying to impart there. So I think this idea that, we again have 28 nations on our governing council that want to identify as democracies and want to work with others in support of democracy is a positive thing. You alluded to this a few minutes ago, though, Colombe, when you talked about some of, I think, Atlas's Indonesian network not feeling as engaged about the war in Ukraine as perhaps European members might. And we have certainly seen that also in the community of democracies. We believe that democracies are diverse, and that, again, they're from all around the world, and they bring different histories. Some are established democracies, and some are very, very new, and some come from colonial or post-conflict backgrounds. Others come from, again, 100, 200 years of evolutionary, incremental democracy making. So that, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges, is for our organization, such as the same for many multilateral organizations. We founded ourselves on this idea of being a consensus organization. Everyone has to agree on everything for us to do something. And I think we're finding that, on the big issues, we're all still there together. But on some issues, we don't necessarily find immediate common ground. Some of our member states from the global South, again, have had a very different history of development, a colonial history, perhaps. And so they view what's happening in Russia and Ukraine in a different manner than does Poland or Romania, next door neighbors to the fighting. So I would say that, we're constantly changing, we're constantly learning how to do this. We're made up of member states, but we have started to work, as you brought up, our Youth Leads program. That's bringing young people who are not elected, who are not diplomats, into our gatherings to tell us what they think. And so maybe in a small way, our program is what, earlier people talked about here, the idea of bringing voices directly to power. So hopefully we were on the right track with something there.
No doubts. And I've had a sneak peek at some of the recommendations, and I think they are absolutely awesome. So I can't wait for them to be published. Good. Thank you so much for this. I think your experience in actually seeing that countries want to come together to to share the same value of democracy is beautiful. And it's something that in this day and in age, especially ahead of Russia's Security Council presidency, it's good to remember that, you know, it is possible to get there, and we just have to work for it. And it's true that obviously the more you are, the more difficult it is, but I think also the more beautiful it is to a certain extent. I have so many follow-up questions, but we are almost out of time. And considering the fact that it's not like I've been asking you about how to change the world and how to solve every single topic out there, I thought that we could close with a very easy question. Obviously, I'm kidding. From Andrea Dorita about polarization and partisan animosity, but I'll let him read it. And obviously, I know this could be a PhD in itself, but if you could share a few thoughts.
Yeah, it's probably such a broad question. The question is about the relationship between democratic values and polarization, political polarization. Like, why does this happen, and how can we tackle the problem? And are there any nations that are particularly good at handling with this problem?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but you know, we did an event recently on misinformation and disinformation, and looking at how democracies can be resilient in the face of this. And something that was really interesting was Canada, which is currently our presidency. They noted that it was not the government's role to be an arbiter of what was true and false, and that it was the right of a Canadian citizen to believe in false things if they wanted to, you know, to pursue their own understanding through the internet of what they wanted to believe. Now, where it had an impact on others' lives and on policy, you know, it was something that needed to be addressed. But, you know, very definitely, we're seeing polarization here in my country of the United States, in which we just can see nothing gets done because people have such, they live in information bubbles, and they don't tend to interact with anyone that differs from them in any way. And so, you know, in democracies, it's become a challenge. We used to always see threats to democracy as external almost. And now I would say the greatest threats to democracy today are almost mainly internal, coming to us from polarized populations, coming to us from misinformation, sometimes from within, sometimes from without. But it's something that we have to really try to focus on and start finding those values that unite citizens of a country or democrats of the world. There's a lot there. So I just put my email online for you all. And certainly, Andrea, if you would like to try to keep the conversation going, we can do that without the time pressure. And I would hope anyone else that would like to speak with me, I'm available to you through email, and I would really enjoy hearing from you.
That's incredibly kind, and I'll be sure to add it in the recording as well, so that members can reach out to you for those who could not make it. So thank you so much. I know we touched upon literally everything from disinformation to democracy to economic injustice, colonialism, and so on. So thank you for jumping through all of those hoops with us. And as I mentioned, we are doing those consultations, and because there's so many of those topics being discussed right now, we wanted to pick your brain, since you are the kind of, you know, go-to expert on the topic of global collaboration and democracy. For everyone, you've heard it, the Community of Democracies is putting out recommendations on how to increase youth participation in democracy, what countries can do, so watch out for it. You can reach out to Thomas Garrett via email. It's tgarrett@community, it's hyphenated, democracies.org. And thank you so much for taking the time. We really, truly appreciate it. And we hope that we'll be able to continue to collaborate in the future.
My best to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.